Margaret Holloway slammed both hands on Harold Vance's supper table so hard the china rattled, and every man in that room went dead silent. "You broke her fingers," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "3 of them, while I was asleep 10 feet away. And you want me to serve you breakfast tomorrow like nothing happened." Harold didn't move. He just looked at her the way a man looks at something he owns that has suddenly misbehaved. "Careful, Margaret," he said softly. "I'm done being careful," she said. And that was the moment Caleb Whitmore understood exactly why this woman had stayed. If this story already has your heart, stay with me until the very last word. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now because this is only the beginning. The trouble with Margaret Holloway was that she made it too easy to overlook her. She was the kind of woman a town decided not to see. Not because there was nothing worth seeing, but because seeing her would have required them to ask questions nobody wanted to answer. She was big. She was quiet. She kept her eyes down and her mouth shut, and she worked from before sunrise until well after dark. And the town of Caldwell, Montana looked right through her the way sunlight goes through glass. Clean. Effortless. Without leaving a mark. Caleb Whitmore had been in Caldwell exactly 4 hours when he first heard her name used as a punchline. He was standing at the bar of the Caldwell Saloon, nursing a whiskey. He'd bought more for the warmth than the taste, when 2 men came in from the cold and dropped their coats on stools and started talking the way men talk when they're comfortable and feel observed by no one. "Saw Margaret Holloway in the street today," the first one said, trying to load feed sacks into Vance's wagon. The second man laughed before the first one even finished. "Lord," he said, "how many sacks?" "3. Took her 4 trips. More laughter, easy laughter, the kind that doesn't cost anything. Caleb looked into his whiskey. "That woman," the first man said, settling into his stool with the satisfaction of someone who has found their subject for the evening. "I don't know what Vance is thinking keeping her on. She's slow, she's—" He paused, searching for the word he wanted, and the pause made it worse somehow. "She ain't exactly what you'd call an asset. Vance keeps her because she works for nothing," the second man said more practically. "Her and that old mother. Where else they gonna go?" "Nowhere," the first man agreed. "That's the point." They laughed again and ordered their drinks and moved on to other topics. And Caleb finished his whiskey and picked up his saddlebag and walked out without saying a word to either of them. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that a lot the first week. He arrived at the Vance Ranch the following morning with a recommendation letter from a foreman 3 counties over and nothing else worth mentioning. No particular plans, no particular past. He was advertising, and a horse named Luther, who was significantly older and more opinionated than he looked. Harold Vance received him in the yard, looked him over with the quick assessing eyes of a man who has hired and discarded enough workers to know within 30 seconds whether one will do, and decided he would. "Fencing along the north pasture," Harold said. "General maintenance through the winter. You'll bunk with the others, eat what the cook makes." He paused. "You drink on the job, you're done. You cause trouble, you're done. You mind your business. We'll get along fine." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. Harold walked away. That was the entirety of the welcome. Caleb unsaddled Luther and put him in the stall and went to find the bunkhouse. And that was when he first saw her. Really saw her, not the punchline version from the saloon, but the actual woman. She was crossing the yard from the smokehouse to the kitchen with a crate balanced against her hip, moving fast despite the weight of it. Her dark hair pulled back tight, her eyes already looking ahead to the next thing she needed to do before this thing was even finished. She didn't look at him. He almost didn't look at her either. But something made him watch an extra second, something in the set of her jaw maybe, or the quality of the focus in her eyes. Like a person who has learned to be in 4 places at once, out of pure necessity. Then she was through the kitchen door and gone, and he went to find his bunk. Supper that first night told him more than a week of asking questions would have. The hands came in from the cold and sat along the long table, and Margaret moved between the kitchen and the dining room with plates and platters and a coffee pot that never seemed to empty. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She wasn't spoken to. The men ate and talked around her like she was furniture, not hostile, just entirely absent in the way they related to her, the way a person stops seeing the table they eat off every day. Caleb watched her work. She was fast. Quietly, efficiently fast, with the kind of practiced motion that comes from years of doing the same tasks in the same space until your body knows the steps without consulting your mind. She refilled cups before they were empty. She replaced platters before they were asked for. She absorbed the needs of 14 men at a long table and met them without a single wasted motion, and not one person at that table acknowledged it. Then, one of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 20, sunburned and self-satisfied in the way of young men who have never been checked, leaned toward the man beside him and said something low, and both of them laughed. Margaret was at the far end of the table. Her back was to them. But her shoulders did something, a fractional tightening, a microsecond of stillness before she kept moving, and Caleb understood that she had heard. She always heard. She'd just learned to keep moving anyway. "Something funny," Caleb said. His voice was quiet. He wasn't looking at the boy directly. He said it the way you say something when you genuinely want to know the answer, and you don't particularly care if the question makes anyone uncomfortable. The boy looked at him, sideswiped. He hadn't expected the new man to say anything. "Just talking," the boy said. Caleb picked up his fork. "Keep it down. Man's trying to eat." The boy's face went red. He said nothing else. Margaret at the far end of the table didn't turn around, but she paused just for a half second and then kept moving. Caleb wasn't sure if she'd heard that either. He wasn't sure why he'd said it. He went back to his food and didn't look at her again for the rest of the meal. He saw Harold Vance for the second time later that evening. Harold came into the kitchen while Caleb was passing through the back of the house on his way to check on Luther, and Harold did not see Caleb because Caleb was already in the shadow of the doorway, and what Caleb saw stopped him where he stood. Harold stood in the center of the kitchen. Margaret was at the stove. Her mother, a small white-haired woman. Caleb hadn't been introduced to, sitting in a chair near the fire, had her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, with the deliberate blankness of someone who has learned that looking at the wrong thing at the wrong time has consequences. Harold said nothing for a long moment. He just stood there. And that silence was doing something. Caleb could see it in the rigid line of Margaret's back, in the way the old woman's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Margaret," Harold said. "Mr. Vance." She didn't turn around. "I found flour on the dining room floor this evening. I'll clean it first thing in the morning. You'll clean it tonight." A pause. Short, controlled. "Yes, sir," she said. Harold looked at the old woman in the chair. He looked at her the way you'd look at a worn piece of equipment you're deciding whether to keep or discard. Then he turned and walked out. Margaret stood at the stove without moving for 5 full seconds. Then she picked up her cloth and went to find the flour. Caleb stepped back into the dark of the doorway and did not let himself be seen, and he stood there for a while after she'd gone with his jaw tight and his hands in his coat pockets, having a quiet and fairly profane argument with himself about what exactly he was going to do with what he had just observed. He checked on Luther. He went to bed. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. He was back out before dawn. It was Silas who explained it to him eventually. Silas Boone was the oldest hand on the Vance property, a spare, weathered man of about 60, who communicated primarily in silences of varying temperature, and who had apparently decided somewhere around his 40th year that the world didn't deserve more than 40 words from him on any given day. But he was not an unkind man. And he was not, Caleb eventually understood, an unintelligent one. "The Holloways," Caleb said one afternoon while they were working fence in the hard cold of the north pasture. "How long have they been here?" Silas kept his eyes on the wire. 9 years. "And before that?" A pause. The wire went taut. "Before that," Silas said, "they had land." Caleb waited. "Robert Holloway," Silas said, "Margaret's father, had himself 400 acres east of here running along Birch Creek. Good land, better than most." He stopped to set a post. Him and Vance had some kind of arrangement, business deal of some kind. Robert died fever 8 years back, and Vance said the land came to him, said Robert owed him, said there were papers. Were there? There were papers, Silas said carefully. Whether they were the right papers is a question nobody asked, because Harold Vance is the kind of man whose answers don't get questioned in this county. Caleb hammered in silence for a moment. And Margaret and her mother had nowhere to go. Vance offered them work. Cook and keep house, they'd have a roof. Silas's voice was entirely without inflection. Generous man. The word dropped between them like a stone into still water. Generous, Caleb said. That's what they say in town. Caleb looked at the horizon. The mother, he said. I've noticed she keeps her hands under her shawl, even when it's warm in the kitchen. The hammering stopped. Silas was very still for a moment. Then he went back to the wire, and his voice, when he spoke, had gone to a place of such careful neutrality that it told Caleb everything. Can't say anything about that, Silas said. Silas, I said I can't say anything about that, Whitmore. He kept working. What I will say is this. You've been here 11 days. You're a good worker, and you mind yourself, and I got no complaints. But men who start asking the wrong questions around here tend to find the work dries up fast. You understand me? I understand you, Caleb said. Good. They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon. But Caleb understood something else too. Something Silas hadn't said, but had put into the shape of his silence. He understood that the older man knew. He understood that Silas had probably known for years. And he understood that knowing without the power to do anything had worn Silas into the kind of man who communicated in silences because words had stopped feeling like they were worth the cost. That evening, Caleb cut his hand on a piece of broken fence wire and had a legitimate reason to go to the kitchen. He knocked first. It was an instinct, and he wasn't sure he could have explained it. Men on working ranches didn't generally knock on the kitchen door, but something in what he'd been observing told him he should. Come in, Margaret said. She was alone. The kitchen was warm, the fire built up for the evening, and she was standing at the work table with a bowl of beans in front of her, and she looked up when he came in with a glance that was already calculating what he needed and how fast she could provide it. Cut my hand, he said, holding it up. Sorry to bother you. Just need something to wrap it. Sit down, she said, already moving to the cabinet. He sat at the kitchen table. She came back with a tin of clean linen strips and set them down and looked at his hand and then briefly, barely at his face. May I? She said. Yes, ma'am. She wrapped the cut with quick, clean efficiency. Her hands were steady. She'd done this many times. When she finished, she started to stand. Miss Holloway, Caleb said. She paused. I'd like to ask you something. He kept his voice even. And I want you to know before I do that I'm not asking out of nosiness. I'm asking because I think it matters. She looked at him with the particular measured caution of a woman who has been disappointed so many times that even the shape of consideration makes her careful. Your mother, he said. Her hands. The silence was immediate and total. Margaret did not move. She did not speak. But something in her expression did what a lake does in the half-second before a stone breaks the surface, a shivering, almost imperceptible recognition. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. I think you do, ma'am. Mr. Whitmore. Her voice was controlled, very controlled. The way a person's voice gets when control is the only thing holding them together. I don't know what you think you've seen, but I'll ask you to keep whatever it is to yourself and not to involve yourself in things that aren't your concern. What if I think they are my concern? Then you'd be wrong. She picked up the tin. Thank you for coming by. I hope your hand heals quick. She turned back to the stove, and Caleb, who knew when a conversation was finished and when it was merely paused, stood up and put on his hat and walked back out into the cold. He gave it 3 more days. He watched Harold move through the house like a man who had never once in his life questioned his right to every inch of space he occupied. He watched the way Margaret tracked Harold's movements without appearing to a skill so refined it was nearly invisible, the skill of a person who has spent years knowing where the danger is without being allowed to acknowledge that danger exists. He watched Evelyn Holloway sit in her chair with her shawl and her fixed gaze and her careful stillness. He watched, and he went back to his bunk at night, and he argued with himself, and he always came to the same place. There are things you can look away from. And then there are things you can't. And the difference between them is not about what they are, it's about what you are. On the 14th day, he was sent to repair the roof of the old storage barn at the far east end of the property. The building was half swallowed by cottonwoods forgotten, looking used for nothing much beyond old equipment and the accumulated debris of years. He climbed up to find the leak, worked his way along the rafters in the low gray light, and his hand landed on something that was not a beam. A tin box, wrapped in oilcloth, wedged deliberately into the space between two rafters where someone had put it and hoped it would stay. He almost left it. And he thought about that afterward, how close the whole thing came to ending right there with a box in a rafter and a man who had learned not to look too close. He took it down. Inside, wrapped in cloth, a leather ledger, and beneath it a folded letter sealed with old wax that had been broken and refolded. He opened the ledger first. The handwriting was small and precise. The entries were financial. Columns of figures with abbreviated labels, dates going back 7-8 years, and Harold Vance's name appearing again and again in a column that had no business containing the numbers it contained. Money that didn't match the ranch's income. Money that came from somewhere else and went somewhere it shouldn't. He set the ledger down and unfolded the letter. The hand was different, looser, urgent, the hand of someone writing against time, and the first line stopped him cold. To whoever finds this, what I write here is the truth as God gives me to tell it. And Robert Holloway was a man of honor who died without justice. Caleb sat down on a grain barrel in the dim cold of that barn and read every word. When he was finished, he sat there for a long time. Then he folded the letter, put it back in the tin, tucked the tin inside his coat, finished the roof repairs, came down at the normal hour, and went to supper and ate everything on his plate and said nothing to anyone. But when Margaret came around with the coffee and leaned past him to refill the cup of the man beside him, he said quietly, not looking up, not turning his head, "Miss Holloway, I need to speak with you tonight. After the house settles. It concerns your father." He heard her breathing change. Just barely. Just for a half second. She didn't answer him. She moved on down the table and finished her rounds and disappeared back into the kitchen, and he did not know if she would come. She knocked at the bunkhouse door at 10:15. The other hands were asleep. He'd been sitting in the dark, and he opened the door without a lamp, and she stepped inside quickly and pulled her shawl tight and looked at him with eyes that were doing a considerable amount of work. "You said my father," she said. No preamble, straight to it. "Yes, ma'am." "What about him?" He set the tin on the table between them. She went very still. "Where did you find that?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Barn roof, east end, up in the rafters." Her eyes moved from the tin to his face. "You read it?" "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes, ma'am." The silence stretched. Then she said very quietly, "Then you know." "I know your father didn't owe Harold Vance anything," he said. "I know that land was your family's free and clear, and those papers Harold produced were not what he said they were. I know your father tried to document it before he died, and I know whoever hid that box was hoping somebody would eventually find it." She reached out and put her hand on the tin. She didn't pick it up yet, just touched it, like it might not be real. "My mother hid it," she said. Her voice was barely there. "Right after my father died. She was afraid Harold would search the house, so she told me years later. She said she put it somewhere a man like Harold would never think to go." She paused. "She said a man like that doesn't climb." Caleb looked at her. "If Harold finds out you have this," she started. "He won't, not yet. You don't know him." Her voice hardened suddenly, the grief in it replaced by something sharper. "You've been here 2 weeks. You think you understand what you're walking into, but you do not. He owns this town. He owns the judge, the sheriff, 2 of the 3 men on the county council. He has had 9 years to make sure that anyone who might have caused him trouble either moved on or found a reason not to speak." She stopped, steadied. The Reverend's wife, she knew something. She started asking questions 3 years ago. Harold was pleasant to her face for 2 months. Then her husband's account at the bank got called in. They left before spring. Caleb said nothing. A ranch hand named Davies found some records in Harold's office about 2 years back. Margaret continued. He was gone 3 days later. Harold said he'd been let go for drinking. Her jaw tightened. Davies didn't drink. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Your mother's hands, he said. She flinched. Not much, but it was there. That happened because she tried to tell the Reverend, Margaret said. Her voice had gone flat in the particular way of someone reporting something they have had to live with so long that the emotion has been worn smooth. 3 years ago, she went to him one Sunday when Harold was out of town, and she tried to tell him what was happening inside this house. Harold found out by Monday. That night, she stopped. He told her she'd fallen. He told her she'd been clumsy. He smiled when he said it. Her eyes came up to his, and the Reverend believed him, or decided to believe him. It amounts to the same thing. Caleb looked at her for a long time. Why did you stay? He asked. After that, why didn't you take her and leave? Something crossed her face. Not surprise. More like the exhausted recognition of a question she has asked herself 1,000 times. Where, she said simply. We have no money that Harold doesn't control. No family left that would take us. Mama can barely walk on cold days her hip for years now. And Harold made very sure that every person in this county who might have helped us believes exactly what he tells them. Her mouth formed something that wasn't quite a smile. That I'm lazy, that I'm slow, that we're lucky to have what we have because Lord knows nobody else would want us. She gestured at herself, short, direct, without self-pity, just a statement of fact. And the thing is, it's easy to make people believe that about a woman like me. A fat woman with no money and no husband and no standing. You don't need much evidence. You just need to say it confidently enough and let people's own assumptions do the rest of the work. The kitchen lamp she'd carried in cast unsteady light across her face, and in it, Caleb could see everything. She was not the thing the town had decided to see, but the actual woman. The intelligence in her eyes, the iron in her jaw, the years of damage she was carrying with a straightness of spine that most people would have lost inside the first year. Miss Holloway, he said, I'm going to help you, if you'll allow it. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they've wanted so badly for so long that wanting it has become dangerous. Why? She said. It was the only question that mattered, and she asked it straight. Because that tin belongs to you. To you, he said. Because what was done to your family was wrong, and it has gone on long enough. And because... He stopped, chose his words. Because I've looked away from things I shouldn't have looked away from before. I'm not going to do it again. The silence between them was long and full. Then Margaret Holloway picked up the tin box and held it against her chest. Both arms wrapped around it, the way you hold something you thought was lost forever. Her eyes closed for a moment. When they opened, they were dry. All her tears for this were years old now. You can't tell anyone, she said. Not yet. Harold has eyes in places you wouldn't think to look. We need to understand what we have before he finds out we have it. Agreed. And you need to understand something. She looked at him steadily. If this goes wrong, and it could go wrong. Caleb, it could go very wrong. It won't only be you who pays for it. It was the first time she'd used his name. He heard it. I understand, he said. She studied his face one more time that long. Checking look going past the surface to see what was actually there. Then she nodded once. She tucked the tin under her shawl and pulled her coat around herself and moved to the door. Miss Holloway, he said quietly. She paused her hand on the door. Your mother hid that box and waited 9 years for someone to find it, he said. She didn't give up. Margaret stood with her back to him for a moment. No, she said softly. She never did. She walked out into the dark. He watched the kitchen light move across the yard and disappear through the back door of the house, and the night closed around the place where she had been. Caleb sat back down on his cot in the dark and rested his elbows on his knees and looked at his bandaged hand. Somewhere across that yard, a woman was carrying a tin box, and 9 years of silence, and a mother with broken fingers and enough courage to fill a room 3 times the size of the one she'd been permitted to occupy. He'd been drifting for 7 years. He thought maybe he'd just found the place where the drifting stopped. She didn't sleep that night. Caleb knew it because the kitchen light never went out. He could see it from his cot, through the narrow gap in the bunkhouse wall, that thin line of amber holding steady, past midnight, past 2, past 3 in the morning, while every other light on the property went dark one by one. She was in there working, or thinking, or both. With Margaret Holloway, he was beginning to understand those two things were rarely separate. He lay on his back and listened to Luther shift in the stall and thought about the letter. He had it memorized now, not because he'd tried to, but because some things sink into a man whether he wants them to or not. Robert Holloway's handwriting. The careful, pressured sentences of a man writing against time and knowing it. Harold Vance presented papers I never signed. I have tried to reach the county recorder in Billings and been turned away twice. I am writing this because I am afraid I will not have the chance to write it later. He had not had the chance to write it later. Caleb turned onto his side and closed his eyes and did not sleep well. Morning came gray and cold, and he was at the breakfast table before most of the other hands. Margaret moved through the kitchen the same way she always did, efficient eyes down, meeting every need before it was voiced. But when she came to refill his cup, her hand was not entirely steady. The coffee splashed slightly against the rim. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. But he turned his cup slightly on the table so the spilled portion was hidden, and he heard her exhale barely, almost nothing as she moved on. That was all. That was the whole of what passed between them that morning. But it was enough. Two of the ranch hands were talking at the far end of the table, a loud, cheerful argument about whether the east fence line needed full replacement or just reinforcement. Normal talk. Working talk. The kind of conversation that fills a room without containing anything. Caleb ate his eggs and listened with half his attention and used the other half to watch Harold Vance's empty chair. Harold came in late. He always came in late. It was one of his habits. Caleb had noticed the small power of making people wait for you. He sat down, and Margaret was already there with his plate and his coffee. And Harold looked at both items, the way a man looks at things that exist purely to serve him, and therefore barely warrant acknowledgement. The Breckett order, Harold said to no one in particular, reading from a paper he'd brought to the table. I need 2 men at the south loading dock by noon. Silas, take Whitmore. Yes, sir, Silas said. Harold ate. He didn't look at Margaret once. But when he stood to leave, he paused behind her chair. She was clearing plates at the near end of the table, and he said quietly enough that only the men immediately close could hear. The butter at breakfast was cold again. I'll see to it, Margaret said. I know you will, Harold said. And there was something in the way he said it, not a threat exactly, more the absolute certainty of a man who has never once in his life had to make a threat twice, that made the back of Caleb's neck go tight. Harold walked out. Margaret kept clearing plates. Caleb picked up his hat. The south loading dock was a 2-mile ride, and Silas spent most of it not saying anything, which was his natural state. But when they were far enough from the ranch that the buildings were small against the sky, Silas said without particular preamble, You talked to her. It wasn't a question. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail. What makes you say that? Because you're different this morning, Silas said. And she's different this morning. And I've been on this property long enough to know what different looks like. Caleb considered for a moment. What do you know about Robert Holloway's land arrangement with Vance? Silas's jaw moved slightly. Not speaking, just processing. I know what I told you. Tell me what you didn't tell me. A long pause. The horses moved steadily beneath them. The cold air smelled of pine and coming snow. Robert came to me once, Silas said finally. His voice was quiet, and even the way a man's voice gets when he's recounting something he's carried a long time. About a month before he died. He was already sick. You could see it in him, the way a man thins out when something's taking him from the inside. He asked me if I'd witnessed any documents between him and Harold. I said no. He asked me if Harold had ever shown me any papers related to land. Silas stopped. I said no to that too, because he hadn't. Caleb looked at him. And Robert said, If anything happens to me, Silas, you remember that. You remember you never witnessed anything." He paused. "Because Harold is going to say you did." The words settled in the cold air between them. "Did he?" Caleb said. "Did Harold say that?" "Harold produced papers 2 weeks after Robert died," Silas said. "3 witnesses signed. I was not one of them. But there were 3 names on those papers, and I knew 2 of those men personally, and one of them told me afterward he'd signed something he didn't fully read, because Harold told him it was routine ranch business and offered him a bottle of good whiskey." "That's fraud," Caleb said. "That's Harold Vance," Silas said. They rode in silence for a while. "Why didn't you say something?" Caleb asked. Not accusatory. He genuinely wanted to know. Silas turned to look at him with eyes that were old and tired in a very specific way. The tiredness of a man who has asked himself the same question. "I was 60 years old, Whitmore. No savings. No family close by. Harold Vance had my employment in one hand and this county's law in the other. And I told myself Margaret and her mother had a roof and food, and it could be worse." He paused. "I've told myself that for 9 years. It gets lighter and heavier at the same time the longer you carry it." "It's going to get heavier before it gets lighter," Caleb said. Silas looked at him for a long moment. "You found something." "Maybe." "Don't tell me what it is," Silas said immediately. "Not yet. If Harold asks me something directly, I can't lie worth a damn, and I never could." He looked back at the trail ahead. "But you tell me when you need me, and I'll be there." Caleb nodded once. They didn't say another word about it all the way to the dock. The Breckett order was straightforward work, loading and inventory, the kind of physical labor that occupies the hands and leaves the mind free. Caleb worked steadily and thought about ledgers. He thought about the column of numbers that didn't match the ranch's legitimate income. He thought about what a man does with money he's taken by fraud and needs to hide. He thought about the witnesses. When they got back to the ranch that afternoon, he found a reason to walk past the main house office, a loose hinge on the exterior shutters. Nothing that required any time at all, but enough of a reason to be where he was. The office window was on the side of the house, and as he worked the hinge with deliberate slowness, he could hear Harold inside. On the telephone, the ranch had one of the county's few private lines, which was itself a kind of statement. Harold's voice was low and businesslike, but Caleb had good ears and the window frame was old and didn't seal tight. "The recording office in Billings," Harold was saying. "I need to confirm those copies are still filed under the right name." A pause. "That's what I pay you for. No, listen to me." Another pause longer. "Then find someone who does. I want confirmation by Friday." Caleb kept working the hinge. "The Holloway situation is stable," Harold said. "It's been stable for 9 years. I don't need you telling me to worry about it." His voice tightened slightly. "She's not going anywhere. Where would she go?" Caleb set down his tool and picked it back up and kept his face entirely neutral. "Just confirm the filing," Harold said, "and tell Morrison I haven't forgotten what he owes me." The conversation ended. Caleb finished with the hinge, which hadn't actually needed fixing, and walked back around to the yard with his tools and the particular calm expression of a man who has learned to hear things without showing that he heard them. Morrison. The name went into the back of his mind and stayed there. That evening, he sought out Margaret deliberately for the first time. She was washing dishes after supper alone in the kitchen, her sleeves pushed up her back straight in the way she always held herself. Like posture was the one thing nobody could take from her. Her mother was in the sitting room off the kitchen, asleep in her chair, her shawl tucked carefully around her. Caleb knocked on the open door. Margaret glanced back. Something moved through her expression quickly, carefully controlled. "Mr. Whitmore, Miss Holloway." He came in and sat at the kitchen table uninvited, but not unwelcome, he thought. "I have a question." She kept washing. "Ask it." "The name Morrison, you know it?" Her hands paused in the water, just briefly. "Hector Morrison. He's the county recorder in Billings. Been in that position for about—" She stopped, turned, looked at him properly now. "Where did you hear that name?" "Harold was on the telephone today." She dried her hands slowly on the cloth near the basin. She came and sat across from him at the table, and in the low light of the kitchen, she looked like a woman who has been running toward something for a very long time and has just caught sight of it on the horizon. "Morrison filed the land papers," she said. "The ones Harold produced after Papa died. Mama always believed Morrison altered them, that the originals showed something different." She pressed her lips together. "But we had no proof and no money and no one who would listen to us. So—" "The ledger has numbers," Caleb said quietly. "Payments. Coded but not well enough. One set of figures comes up every few months, consistent amount, no ranch-related label, just initials." He paused. "HM. The air in the kitchen changed." Margaret stared at him. Harold was paying Morrison. Has been paying him. Present tense if that call was any indication. She put both hands flat on the table. He could see her working through it, the implications, the shape of it, the thing it meant if it was true. Her mind was fast. He'd noticed that early. She didn't need things explained twice. "That's not just fraud," she said. "That's ongoing criminal conspiracy." "Yes, ma'am. And you found it in the ledger." "Enough to make a strong argument for it. Not enough to take to a judge on its own." He leaned forward slightly. "I need to know, are there other records? Anything your father kept separately from what's in the tin? Anything your mother might know about?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and went to the doorway of the sitting room and looked at her mother sleeping soundly. Her white hair loose around her shoulders, her injured hand resting on top of the shawl. She came back and sat down, and her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. "Papa kept a second set of records," she said. "Mama told me once years ago when she was having a bad night. She said Papa didn't trust Harold from the beginning. Said he had the instinct of a man who knew he was dealing with a snake but couldn't prove it yet. So Papa kept his own books. Every transaction, every agreement, every conversation he thought mattered." She stopped. "Mama didn't put those in the tin. She said they were too bulky. She hid them somewhere else." Caleb looked at her steadily. "Where?" "I don't know," Margaret said. "And I can't ask her directly, not without explaining why I'm asking. And if she knows you have the tin—" She shook her head. "Mama has a heart that's held together with very little Mr. Whitmore. She's stronger than she looks, but if she thinks there's movement on this and it goes wrong, it won't go wrong. You can't promise me that." "No," he said honestly. "I can't. But I can tell you I'm not going to move on anything until we have enough to make it stick. One chance. That's all we're going to get." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "There's a loose board in the floor of the tack room. Papa used to spend time out there, said the smell of leather helped him think. I always thought that was strange because he wasn't particularly a horseman." She paused. "I haven't looked under that board in 9 years." Caleb nodded once and stood up. "Not tonight," she said quickly. "Harold checks the outbuildings at 10. He does it every third night, some kind of habit he developed after a break-in years ago." "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching him longer than you have," she said simply. He sat back down. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any of the words that would come later, but the quiet shift of two people who have recognized each other as being on the same side of something that matters. "Tell me about the ranch records," he said. "The ones you've had access to. You do the household accounts. Have done for 6 years. Harold thought it was practical. Why pay a bookkeeper when the cook can do arithmetic?" Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Almost dry. Almost humor. "He didn't realize I was reading everything. Not just the household accounts. The ranch ledgers, the expense records, the contracts with buyers. I have a good memory, Mr. Whitmore. Always have." "What did you find?" She leaned forward. And for the next 30 minutes, Margaret Holloway told him things that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The ranch's actual income was nearly double what Harold reported to the county tax office. The difference, hundreds of dollars annually compounded over years, had been quietly redirected through a series of transactions that appeared legitimate on the surface, equipment purchases from companies that shared a silent partner with Harold, maintenance contracts paid to businesses that existed only on paper, loans extended to ranch hands who had long since left the county. Clean looking on the page. Difficult to trace without knowing what you were looking at. "He's been doing it for years," Margaret said. "Long before my father died. I think Papa stumbled onto the edge of it. I think that's why Harold needed the land, not just for its value, but because Papa was close to seeing the whole picture, and Harold needed him removed from the equation." "Removed," Caleb said carefully. Margaret looked at him steadily. "Papa's fever came on fast. He was a healthy man. 44 years old, no prior illness." She paused. "I was 20 years old when he died, and I didn't know what I know now. But Mama—" She stopped. "Mama has never believed it was a natural fever." The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb absorbed that, sat with it, did not rush past it. "That's a serious thing to believe," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "It is." Her voice was perfectly level. "And it is also the kind of thing that if you say it out loud without proof, gets you called hysterical and grieving and unstable, and gets a very powerful man very interested in making sure you stop talking." She met his eyes. "So I've never said it out loud. Until right now. To you." He looked back at her. "I won't repeat it," he said. "Not until there's something to back it up. But I hear you." She nodded. Just once. From the sitting room, Evelyn Holloway made a soft sound in her sleep and shifted in her chair. Margaret was on her feet, instantly moving to the doorway, checking. And Caleb watched her do it and understood something he hadn't quite put words to before. Every instinct this woman had was oriented toward one thing. Every decision she made, every calculation, every risk she took or declined to take, all of it came back to the same point. Her mother. Not herself. Not the land. Not justice even. Her mother. She came back to the table when she was satisfied Evelyn was settled. "I should get to bed," she said. "Harold rises early when he's got county business." "One more thing," Caleb said. "The hands on this ranch, who can we trust?" She considered. "Silas. Genuinely. He's been carrying guilt about my father for 9 years and he knows it. If you've already spoken to him—" "I have. Then you already know." She thought for another moment. "Danny Pruitt. The younger one, not his brother. Danny's here because he needed work and Harold was hiring. He's got no particular loyalty to the man. He's also got eyes and doesn't like what he sees. I've watched him watch Harold the way you'd watch something you're not sure of." She paused. "That's 2. Maybe 3 if you count Pete Larson. But Pete has a family in town, and he's frightened of losing the wage." "2 is enough to start," Caleb said. He stood and picked up his hat. She stayed seated, her hands folded on the table, watching him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He paused. "Today, at the loading dock." She hesitated, a rare thing he'd noticed for a woman who chose her words so deliberately. "Harold said something to me before you left. He said—" She stopped. Started again. "He said he'd noticed the new hand was spending a lot of time near the main house. He said he hoped I wasn't getting ideas." Caleb kept his face still. "What kind of ideas?" He didn't specify. Her voice was dry and precise. "With Harold, he doesn't need to. The implication is the message." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You told me this so I'd be careful." "I told you this so you'd understand," she said. "He notices more than he appears to notice. He's been managing people his whole life, and he's very good at it. Don't underestimate him by thinking he's just a bully. He's a bully who is also very intelligent and very patient." "I won't underestimate him," Caleb said. "Good." She stood and began stacking the remaining cups on the shelf efficiently, with finality. The conversation over in the way she ended things, not with a dramatic moment, but with a practical movement. "The tack room board. Whenever you find a window." "I'll find one." He walked out into the cold. The yard was dark, the buildings quiet, the sky thick with cloud that had been threatening snow all day. He crossed to the bunkhouse with his head down against the wind. He was almost to the door when he heard it. A voice. Harold's voice from the direction of the stable. Low, and another voice with it deeper, rougher. A man Caleb didn't recognize. He slowed his steps without appearing to slow them, adjusting the angle of his walk to bring him closer to the stable wall without heading toward it. "The survey comes back next week," the unfamiliar voice was saying. "You want me to sit on it until after the council meeting?" "Until after Christmas," Harold said. "Then we file." "What about the Birch Creek parcel?" A pause. "What about it?" "Morrison says it's still technically in dispute in the secondary filing. He says whoever originally registered it might have a claim if—" "Morrison needs to do his job," Harold said. His voice had gone very quiet. "I pay him to make problems disappear, not to report them to me. Tell him that." "Yes, sir. And tell him if this surfaces before I've handled it, his arrangement with me becomes considerably less comfortable." Harold's voice was pleasant. Utterly pleasant. The way a man's voice gets when he's saying something terrible in the tone of weather conversation. "He understands what I mean." Footsteps, moving away, toward the road. Caleb stood against the bunkhouse wall for a full 2 minutes after the sound died. Then he went inside. The tack room visit happened 2 mornings later on a Thursday, during the window between Harold's departure for a county meeting in town and the return of the hands from the north pasture. Caleb had 3/4 of an hour. He didn't need it all. The loose board was exactly where Margaret had said, third plank from the south wall, near the corner post. It moved when he pressed the right spot, a clean lift, like it had been opened and closed many times before, and the wood remembered the motion. Beneath it was a leather satchel, oilcloth wrapped like the tin, dry and intact. He lifted it into the light. Inside, 37 pages of Robert Holloway's handwriting. Meticulous, numbered, dated. Records going back 15 years. Every conversation with Harold Vance that Robert thought worth noting. Every transaction. Every promise made, and what actually happened afterward. And in the last 10 pages, written close together. The handwriting slightly less steady. A detailed account of what Robert had discovered about Harold's financial arrangements, including 3 names Caleb didn't yet recognize, and one he did, Morrison. But there was something else. Something Caleb read 3 times to make sure he was reading it correctly. Robert Holloway had found a second witness. Someone who had seen the original land documents before Harold altered them. Someone who had signed an affidavit. Robert had attached a copy, small and folded and water-stained at one edge, but entirely legible, stating that the papers Harold later produced in probate court were not the papers Robert Holloway had signed. The witness was still alive. His name was Arthur Gaines, and Robert's notes listed him as residing in the town of Bitter Creek, 40 miles northeast. Caleb sat back on his heels in the tack room and read the name twice. Then he put everything back exactly as he'd found it, replaced the board, and walked out into the cold morning with his hands in his pockets and his mind running faster than it had run in years. He was halfway across the yard when he nearly walked directly into Margaret. She'd come from the direction of the chicken coop carrying a basket, and she stopped short when she saw his face. "What?" she said, immediately, no preamble. "Not here," he said very quietly. "Tonight." She looked at him for a half-second, reading him the way she read everything, fast and accurately. Whatever she saw made her nod once and walk on without another word. He spent the rest of the day doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, and doing it well enough that nobody had any reason to look at him twice. He repaired a gate latch. He helped move a load of hay from the south barn. He ate dinner and said 3 sentences to the men around him and retired at the normal hour. At 9:30, Margaret knocked twice on the bunkhouse door. He opened it before the second knock finished. She came in. She looked at him and said, "Tell me." So he did. He told her about the satchel, about the 37 pages, about the 3 names, and Morrison and the altered documents. He watched her face as he talked, the careful, controlled attention of a woman who is absorbing something large while keeping herself exactly in one piece. Then he told her about Arthur Gaines. Something happened to her face that he hadn't seen before. Not tears, she was past tears on this subject. Something more fundamental than that. The look of a person who has been standing in the dark for a very long time and has just heard from a distance the sound of a door opening. "He's alive," she said, barely above a whisper. "According to your father's notes. Papa found him." She pressed a hand briefly over her mouth, took it away. Hey. Papa found him and Harold never knew. It appears that way. Caleb. She said his name without thinking this time, just said it straight and direct. If Arthur Gaines is still alive and will testify, that's not just evidence. That's a witness who can stand in front of a judge and say the original documents were different. That's the whole case. She stopped. That's everything. It's not nothing, he said carefully. But Bitter Creek is 40 miles. I'd need a reason to go that Harold wouldn't question. She was already thinking he could see it the way her eyes moved slightly when her mind was working fast. Henderson's supply run, she said. He takes the wagon to Bitter Creek every 6 weeks for specialty goods Harold orders from the mercantile there. The next run is 10 days from now. You could volunteer to go along. You're new enough that it wouldn't seem strange to want extra wages. Would Henderson talk? Henderson doesn't talk about anything. He barely talks about the weather. She paused. But Caleb, 10 days. Harold has that call in with Morrison. If Morrison gets nervous and starts acting nervous. Harold won't move before the council meeting, Caleb said. He said so himself. She looked at him sharply. You heard him on the telephone. And in the stable yard, 2 nights ago. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite fear, but its practical cousin. He's accelerating something. I don't know what exactly. But the past 2 weeks he's been on that telephone more than I've ever seen him. And there was a man here last night after midnight that I didn't recognize. I know, Caleb said. I heard them. What did they say? He told her about the Birch Creek parcel. About Morrison. About Harold's very quiet, very pleasant voice, saying that his arrangement would become considerably less comfortable. She absorbed it without flinching. But her hands clasped in her lap, pressed together more tightly. He's filing something, she said. Something that will make the land arrangement permanent and unchallengeable. Once it's in the county record in the right way. I know. 10 days, Caleb. Her voice had an edge now, not panic, but precision. The sharpness of someone who has spent years calculating narrow margins and knows exactly how little room she has. We have 10 days before you can get to Bitter Creek and Arthur Gaines, and we don't know how much time after that before Harold does whatever he's planning to do. And in those 10 days, I still have to cook his breakfast and serve his supper and smile at the right moments and give him no reason to look at either of us any harder than he already is. She said it like a simple statement of fact, like it was just the shape of the problem, not a description of something that required extraordinary endurance to do. Miss Holloway, Caleb said. She looked at him. I know what this has cost you, he said. Everything you're carrying, the years of it. He stopped. Then, I need you to hold on just a little longer. She was very still. I've been holding on for 9 years, Caleb Whitmore, she said quietly. I know. He looked at her directly. I know you have. And I know you didn't need me to tell you to keep doing it. I'm just... He stopped, searched for the honest word. I'm just glad you did. She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than most. Then she stood, straightened her spine with that particular bearing that he had come to understand was not stubbornness, but a kind of armor she had built from the only materials available to her, and she picked up her lamp. 10 days, she said. 10 days, he agreed. She walked out. He watched the light move across the yard. From the main house in Harold Vance's office window, a lamp was burning. A shadow moved behind the glass there, and gone there, and gone. The slow, deliberate movement of a man who believed he had accounted for everything. Caleb looked at that window for a long time. He hadn't. The 10 days felt like 10 years. Caleb worked. He showed up where he was supposed to show up, did what he was supposed to do, said what a man in his position would say, and gave Harold Vance absolutely nothing to look at. It was one of the more demanding performances of his life, and it required the kind of sustained quiet discipline that most people confused with passivity. It wasn't passivity, it was precision. Margaret was better at it than he was. She moved through those 10 days like a woman who had been performing exactly this role for so long that performance had become indistinguishable from living. Breakfast at 6. Dinner at noon. Supper at 6. Harold's eggs hot. Harold's coffee strong. Harold's preferences anticipated and met before he voiced them, because voicing them meant he had noticed they weren't already taken care of, and being noticed for the wrong reason. In Harold Vance's house had consequences that settled on Evelyn Holloway's body rather than Margaret's. That was the thing Caleb kept coming back to. The elegance of Harold's cruelty. He never touched Margaret directly. He didn't need to. He had found something more efficient, a point of pressure that required no physical contact and left no mark anyone could point to. He simply let Margaret understand through 9 years of small and consistent demonstrations that her resistance would be paid for by someone who couldn't defend herself. It was the kind of system that only a very particular type of mind could design. And it had worked without interruption for nearly a decade. On the third day, Harold called Margaret into his office. Caleb was near the hallway window and heard every word. "I've had a complaint," Harold said. His voice was easy, conversational. The voice he used when he wanted someone to understand how little effort it cost him to make their life difficult. "From 2 of the hands. They say the evening meal has been late 3 times this week." "I apologize, Mr. Vance," Margaret said. "I've been managing Mama's—" "I didn't ask for an explanation," Harold said. "I asked for the problem to be corrected." A pause. "Yes, sir," Margaret said. "Good." The sound of papers being moved. "Also, the new hand, Whitmore." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What about him?" Margaret's voice was perfect. Entirely neutral. The kind of neutral that takes years to achieve. "I've noticed he's been helpful around the kitchen, dropping things off, picking things up." Harold paused. "I run a clean operation here, Margaret. I think you know what I mean by that." "Mr. Whitmore has been nothing but professional," she said. "I'm sure he has." Harold's voice was still pleasant, still easy. "And I'd like it to stay that way, which means keeping things simple. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir, we understand each other." Caleb listened to her footsteps move back down the hallway toward the kitchen. Steady, unhurried. The walk of a woman who would not give a single inch of her dignity to the man behind that office door. He exhaled slowly and went back to work. That evening she passed him in the yard without looking at him and said very quietly without breaking stride, "He's watching us both. Be careful for the next few days." "Understood," he said, equally quiet. They didn't speak again for 4 days. It was the longest 4 days Caleb had spent in recent memory, and he'd spent some genuinely difficult stretches. He worked the fence line in the cold and thought about Arthur Gaines in Bitter Creek, and whether a man who had signed an affidavit 9 years ago and then heard nothing more about it would still be willing to stand up in front of a judge and say what he'd seen. People changed. Memories changed. Fear had a way of reshaping what a person remembered being willing to do back when the consequences felt theoretical. On the 5th day, something happened that nobody had planned for. Evelyn Holloway fell. Not badly, not this kind of fall that breaks bones or puts a person in bed for weeks. She caught her hip against the edge of the sitting room doorframe and went down, and the sound of it. A sharp gasp, and then a heavier sound brought Margaret from the kitchen at a run and brought Caleb from the yard at almost the same speed, because the kitchen door was open and sound carried. He came through the back door to find Margaret already on her knees on the floor, her arms around her mother, speaking in a low and steady voice that was holding something back through considerable effort. Evelyn was sitting up, shaking her head, saying she was fine, she was perfectly fine. Margaret didn't need to fuss. Caleb stopped in the doorway. "She's all right," Margaret said, not looking up. Her voice was controlled. I've got her." "Let me help," he said. "I've got her." He heard the edge in it and stayed where he was. Evelyn looked up at him from the floor. Her eyes were sharp and bright, and entirely unlike the carefully blank expression she wore whenever Harold was in the room. She looked in this unguarded moment like a woman who had been intelligent and observant her whole life and had simply learned to hide both those things for survival. "You're the new hand," Evelyn said, not accusatory, just precise. "Yes, ma'am. Caleb Whitmore." She looked at him for a moment with those sharp eyes. Then she said to Margaret, "Help me up, please. I'm too old to have conversations from the floor." Margaret helped her up. guided her to the chair, settled the shawl around her with practiced, gentle hands. Evelyn arranged herself with the dignity of a woman who refuses to be reduced by circumstances, and then she looked at Caleb again. "You've been here 3 weeks," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Harold's hands don't usually come in the kitchen door." "Mama," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not being unfriendly," Evelyn said calmly. "I'm being observant. There's a difference." She kept her eyes on Caleb. "You found something." The kitchen went very still. Caleb looked at Margaret. Margaret's face had gone carefully expressionless. "Mama, I'm not senile Margaret. I'm old, and I have a bad hip, and Harold Vance broke 3 of my fingers 2 years ago, but my mind is exactly what it has always been." She folded her hands in her lap, the injured one tucked beneath the other, in a gesture so habitual it was probably unconscious by now. "And what it has always been is fairly good at reading a room." She looked steadily at Caleb. "Robert hid things. He told me he did. He told me where some of them were, and I moved them after he died because I knew Harold would search." She paused. "You found the tin in the barn roof." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "And the satchel under the tack room floor." "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Margaret stood beside her mother's chair with her hand resting on the older woman's shoulder, and her face was doing something complicated, relief and fear arriving at the same time, taking up the same space. "There's a third thing," Evelyn said. Caleb went very still. "Ma'am, Robert kept 3 sets. He was a thorough man." She looked at her hands. The tin was the evidence. The satchel was the record. The third— She stopped. "The third is the name. Someone who can verify everything Robert documented. A man who was present when Harold proposed the original arrangement, and who heard Harold say in plain words that the land would never leave the Holloway family." She paused. "Robert called him the anchor. He said if we ever had the evidence and the record, the anchor would make it all hold." "Arthur Gaines," Caleb said. Evelyn looked up sharply. "You know that name. It's in your husband's notes. He found him. He had an affidavit." For a moment, Evelyn Holloway's composure did something it had not done in a very long time. It slipped. Just slightly. Just at the edges. And what was underneath was not grief exactly. It was the expression of a woman who has been hoping for something for so long that hope and pain have become the same feeling. "Robert found him," she said softly, "before he died." "Yes, ma'am. He wrote it down." She straightened, pulled herself back together with the same deliberate bearing that her daughter had clearly learned from her. "Then you need to go to Bitter Creek. Tell him that Evelyn Holloway says Robert's last words were that Arthur Gaines was a man of his word. He'll know what that means." Caleb nodded. She looked at him for another long moment. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Whitmore? And I'd like the honest answer, not the polite one." He thought about it genuinely. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "And because I've left too many right things undone in my life already." Evelyn regarded him steadily. Then she said, "Margaret, make this man a proper cup of coffee. He's been drinking that bunkhouse swill for 3 weeks and it shows." Margaret made a sound that was startlingly briefly, very nearly a laugh. It was the first time Caleb had heard anything close to it from her. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the best cup of coffee he'd had in years, and nobody said anything much, and the quiet in that kitchen was entirely unlike every other quiet in that house. 3 days before the supply run, Harold Vance brought a stranger to the ranch. His name was given as Mr. Aldous, and he was introduced to no one except Harold, who walked him through the property with the proprietary satisfaction of a man showing off something he was particularly pleased to own. Caleb watched them from the fence line. Aldous was a city man. You could see it in how he held himself, how he moved across the uneven ground with slight, careful adjustments. He carried a leather case. He spent a long time in Harold's office with the door closed. Danny Pruitt materialized at Caleb's elbow while he was watching. Danny was 23 years old, quiet in a thoughtful rather than sullen way, and had a habit of appearing near conversations he wasn't technically part of. "Land assessor," Danny said without preamble. Caleb looked at him. "How do you know?" Because I was in the stable when Harold told Aldous where to put his horse, and I heard him say he wanted the Birch Creek survey in the report, alongside the main parcel. Danny kept his eyes on the two men crossing the yard. Harold's combining the parcels, filing them as one continuous property. He paused. Once it goes in combined, separating them out again would take an act of God and a judge Harold doesn't already own. Caleb calculated rapidly. When does the report get filed? Harold told him end of month. Danny glanced at him. That's 12 days. The supply run to Bitter Creek was in 3 days. Arthur Gaines, the affidavit. 12 days. It was tight. It was very tight. Danny, Caleb said, if I needed a second man in Bitter Creek, would you be able to make a reason to go? Danny looked at him with eyes that were older than 23. I've been looking for a reason to be useful in this situation for about 4 months, he said. So yes. Caleb told him enough. Not everything, not yet, but enough that Danny understood the shape of it and what was at stake. He watched Danny's face as he talked. The young man didn't flinch and didn't reach for drama. He just listened, asked 2 precise questions, and then said, All right, I'll tell Henderson I need to pick up a part for the wagon harness in Bitter Creek. He won't question it. Good, Caleb said. One thing, Danny said. Harold's been watching you. Not obviously, but he is. If you're gone on the supply run the same week, Aldous files that survey report, he might... I know, Caleb said. It's a risk. Danny considered. Worth it. Yes, Caleb said. Danny nodded once and went back to work. The night before the supply run, Caleb found Margaret at the rain barrel behind the kitchen where she went sometimes in the late evening. Not for any practical reason he had gathered, but because it was one of the few places on the property that Harold had no particular reason to be. Tomorrow, she said before he could speak. Tomorrow, he confirmed. She had her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She looked at the sky thick with stars in the way that only existed out here away from town. Lights where the dark was complete enough to show you everything above it. What if he won't come, she said. Gaines. What if he's moved or he's... Then we use what we have and we find another way. The assessor is here, Caleb. I know. Harold is filing in 12 days. I know that too. She turned to look at him. In the starlight, her face was very serious and very clear and very much itself, no performance in it, none of the carefully constructed neutrality she wore inside the house. Just Margaret, the actual one. I need you to understand something, she said. If this fails, if you go to Bitter Creek and Gaines won't come, or the evidence isn't enough, Harold is going to find out we tried. He always finds out. And when he does, it won't be me who pays for it first. The words landed exactly where she intended them to. He felt them. I understand, he said. Do you? Her voice was quiet and direct. Because I need the man I'm trusting with this to understand it completely. Not theoretically. Not in the abstract. I need you to understand that my mother is sitting in that kitchen right now with her hand that will never fully close again, and that she is the price Harold will collect if this goes wrong. Margaret. He said her name and she stopped. He looked at her directly. I understand. I have understood since the night I heard you in the yard and saw her hands. That is exactly why I'm not going to let it go wrong. She looked at him for a long moment, searching, finding what she was looking for, or at least enough of it. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. They stood there for a moment close enough that he could have reached for her hand if he were a different kind of man in a different kind of moment. He wasn't, and it wasn't, and both of them knew it. But something passed between them in the cold air under all those stars, something that didn't have a name yet and didn't need one. Come back fast, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. She went inside. He stood in the yard for another minute and then went to his bunk and slept better than he had any right to. Bitter Creek was 40 miles of hard road in November, and Henderson drove the wagon with the economical grim efficiency of a man who regarded conversation as a structural weakness. Caleb sat beside him and let the silence ride. Danny Pruitt sat in the wagon bed behind them with his hat pulled low and said even less. Caleb had Robert Holloway's notes in his coat. He'd copied the relevant pages by lamplight 3 nights prior, in careful handwriting that was not his own natural hand, and put the originals back in the satchel, and the satchel back under the board exactly as he'd found it. The copies he carried. The originals stayed where they were, because if anything went wrong on this road, he was not going to be the reason the evidence disappeared. They arrived in Bitter Creek at noon. Henderson went to the mercantile. Danny went to find the harness part that didn't strictly need finding. Caleb went to find Arthur Gaines. He found him on the second try. A hardware store on the main street, and behind the counter, a man of perhaps 70, with hands that had worked outdoors for most of his life, and eyes that were sharply, uncomfortably alert for a man who looked like he was just minding a store. "Mr. Gaines," Caleb said. The man looked at him without expression. "Don't know you." "No, sir. My name is Caleb Whitmore. I work at the Vance Ranch in Caldwell." He kept his voice even and his hands visible. "I'm here on behalf of the Holloway family." Something happened in Arthur Gaines's face. Very fast, very controlled. But it was there a flicker of something that lived between recognition and dread. "I think you'd better come around back," Gaines said. The back of the hardware store was quiet and smelled of oil and sawdust, and Arthur Gaines pulled 2 stools from beneath a workbench and sat on one and gestured at the other and looked at Caleb with eyes that had clearly been waiting for something like this moment for a considerable number of years. "Is Evelyn well?" he said. "First thing, before anything else." "She's alive," Caleb said carefully. "She's not well. Not entirely." Gaines's jaw tightened. "Harold." "Yes, sir. I should have." Gaines stopped himself. An old argument, clearly. One he had worn a groove in over the years. "Tell me what you have," Caleb told him. "Laid it out clean and complete: the tin, the ledger, the satchel, Robert's notes, the Morrison payments, the assessor, the 12 days. He put the copied pages on the workbench and let Gaines read them. Watched the older man's face while he read the tightening around the eyes, the set of his mouth, the small nod at certain passages that meant recognition. When Gaines finished, he set the pages down and was quiet for a long moment. "I signed an affidavit," he said. 9 years ago, Robert came to me. Lord, he was already sick. I could see it, and he told me what Harold was doing, and I signed it. I kept a copy." He looked at the workbench. "I've had that copy in my safe ever since, waiting for someone to come ask for it." He paused. "I'd started to think nobody would." "Evelyn says to tell you that Robert's last words were that Arthur Gaines was a man of his word." Gaines was silent for a very long time. "Lord," he said quietly. And then after another moment, "Yes, I'll come. You tell me when, and I'll come. We have 12 days before Harold files the combined survey. After that it becomes considerably more complicated, I know. I know how these things work." Gaines stood up from his stool with the careful movement of an older man who still moved well enough. "I'll need 2 days to arrange the store. I can be in Caldwell by the end of the week." He paused. "You'll need a judge who isn't Harold's." "I know. There's a circuit judge, Harlan Briggs. He rides through the county seat every 3rd Thursday. He's in Billings right now, but he'd be in Reed's Crossing by Thursday next." Gaines looked at him steadily. "He doesn't owe Harold anything. I know that for a fact because Harold once tried to make him owe him something, and Briggs told him what he could do with that idea." Caleb felt something shift the shape of the problem, changing a door appearing where there had been only wall. "You know Judge Briggs?" "I know his brother better, but yes." Gaines met his eyes. "You bring me to Reed's Crossing with everything you have, and I'll have a conversation with Harlan Briggs that Harold Vance is not going to enjoy hearing about." Caleb picked up the copied pages and looked at this man, this hardware store keeper in Bitter Creek, who had sat on a signed affidavit for 9 years and kept faith with a dead man's family when it would have been so much easier to simply forget, and felt something that he recognized after a moment as genuine respect. "Mr. Gaines," he said, "Evelyn Holloway's daughter has been cooking that man's breakfast for 9 years to keep her mother safe." Gaines looked at him with eyes that held 9 years of their own weight. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry it took this long." They shook hands. Caleb was back in the wagon before Henderson had finished loading the dry goods. Danny fell in beside him in the wagon bed, One look at Caleb's face, telling him everything he needed to know, and the two of them rode back toward Caldwell in silence, while the late afternoon light went long and gold across the flats. He needed to tell Margaret. He needed to do it before Harold noticed anything had shifted, before the altered quality of Caleb's movements or the particular steadiness in his face registered on a man who had spent decades watching for exactly those kinds of changes in the people around him. He found her that evening, in the only way that was safe, in plain sight in the kitchen, while he was technically returning an empty bucket to the back porch. He set the bucket down near the door. She was at the stove. Harold was in the front of the house. "He's coming," Caleb said very quietly, not looking at her, adjusting the bucket's position unnecessarily. Her hand on the ladle did not move. She did not turn around, but he saw her breathe a single deep, controlled breath that was the most private thing he had ever watched another person do. "When?" she said. Same volume, equally still. End of the week. Reed's Crossing. There's a judge. A pause. Does he have the affidavit? In his safe. 9 years. Another pause. Longer. "Mama will want to know," she said. "I know. Tell her carefully. I know how to tell my mother things carefully." "Caleb," she said very quietly, with a dryness in it that was not unkind. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You do." He picked up the bucket and walked back out. Behind him in the kitchen, he heard the ladle hit the side of the pot. Not a bang, not a clatter, but a single deliberate tap. Like a period at the end of a sentence. Like someone marking the end of one long chapter and the beginning of whatever came next. Howe was back at the bunkhouse pulling off his coat when Silas appeared in the doorway. The older man had the look he got when he knew something, not the careful blankness he used when he was choosing not to speak, but the tighter, more alert expression of a man who has seen something he feels obligated to report. "Harold had company tonight," Silas said. "After supper. That Aldous man came back." Caleb looked up. "At night. Late. They were in the office for 2 hours. When Aldous left, Harold made a telephone call." Silas's voice was even and deliberate. "I was in the hallway. Not intentionally, just—" "What did you hear?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "He said the filing date was being moved up. He said he wanted it done by end of next week, not end of month." He paused. He sounded the way Harold sounds when he's decided something is already finished. Caleb sat down on his cot. The math had just changed. End of next week meant 8 days. Not 12. 8 days to get Arthur Gaines from Bitter Creek to Reed's Crossing, and in front of Judge Briggs, before Harold combined those parcels and buried the Holloway land under his name so deep that even the truth wouldn't be able to dig it out. "Silas," he said, "I need you to do something for me." The older man straightened slightly. "Name it. I need you to find a reason, a legitimate reason, something. Harold won't question for Margaret and her mother to be out of this house on Thursday." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing. "Her mother's hip has been bad," he said slowly. "Margaret's mentioned the doctor in Reed's Crossing has been recommended for older joint complaints. It'd be natural for her to take Evelyn." "Would Harold permit it?" "Harold would tell her she's wasting time," Silas said. "But Evelyn's too old and worn-looking for Harold to bother objecting to medical visits. Makes him look charitable letting her go." His mouth did something grim. "He likes looking charitable. Can you suggest it to Margaret in a way that sounds like your own idea without connecting it to anything else?" Silas looked at him steadily. "I've been watching that family for 9 years, Whitmore. I think I can manage one conversation without tipping my hand." "Yes," Caleb said. "I think you can." Silas nodded and turned to go. He paused in the doorway. "Robert Holloway was a good man," he said, without looking back, without inflection. Just a statement placed carefully in the air. He deserved better than what he got. He walked out. Caleb sat in the dark of the bunkhouse for a long time. 8 days. Arthur Gaines on the road. Judge Briggs in Reed's Crossing. 9 years of documented fraud in a leather satchel under a tack room floor. A signed affidavit in a hardware store safe. A county recorder in Billings, who had been receiving payments from a man who was about to file papers that would make all of it moot, and across the yard in a house she had never been permitted to call her own. Margaret Holloway was setting Harold Vance's breakfast table for tomorrow morning, because that was what she did, and she did it without flinching, and she did it while carrying everything Caleb knew she was carrying. He thought about what she'd said to him in the dark by the rain barrel. I need you to understand it completely, not theoretically, not in the abstract. He understood it completely. He also understood something else now, something that had been building since the first night he'd stood in the dark and heard a sound that lived between a scream and a sob, something that had nothing to do with evidence or affidavits or circuit court judges. There was a woman in that house who had held this weight alone for 9 years and had not broken under it. Not because she wasn't human, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had decided somewhere along the way that the only thing more unbearable than carrying it was setting it down. He wasn't going to let her carry it alone anymore. In Harold Vance's office window, the lamp burned late into the night. Thursday was 6 days away. 6 days moved. The way time moves when something enormous is waiting at the end of it, simultaneously too fast and too slow, each hour carrying more weight than the one before it. Caleb worked. Margaret cooked. Harold managed his empire with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never once looked up to check whether the ground beneath him was still solid. And underneath all of it, quiet as water moving under ice, everything was shifting. Silas delivered his suggestion about the doctor in Reed's Crossing on Monday morning in the kitchen in front of 2 other hands with the casual offhandedness of a man making small talk. He mentioned that his own sister had seen a specialist for her hip in Reed's Crossing and had found it worthwhile. He mentioned it was only a day's ride. He mentioned almost as an afterthought that Mrs. Holloway was looking tired lately. Margaret received it with exactly the right amount of consideration, not too eager, not dismissive. She said she'd think about it. She mentioned it to Harold that evening. Harold said it was her time to waste if she wanted to waste it, which was as close to permission as anyone got from Harold Vance, and everyone in that house knew it. Tuesday passed. Wednesday passed. Caleb received word through Danny that Arthur Gaines had left Bitter Creek on Tuesday morning and would reach Reed's Crossing by Wednesday evening. Danny had gotten that information through a contact in Bitter Creek, without either of them having to explain to Harold why they were communicating with anyone 40 miles away. Judge Briggs, according to what Gaines had conveyed through that same channel, would see them Thursday afternoon. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, smelling of snow that hadn't fallen yet. Margaret came to breakfast, looking exactly as she always looked, composed, efficient, unremarkable. She told Harold at breakfast that she would take her mother to Reed's Crossing that morning if he had no objection. Harold said he had no objection provided supper was ready by 6. She said it would be. He went back to his newspaper. Evelyn was in the wagon by 8 o'clock. Caleb was already gone. He and Danny had ridden out at 5 that morning under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, taking the east road that swung wide around the main trail, adding 2 miles to the distance, but eliminating any chance of passing someone who knew Harold Vance well enough to mention having seen his hands heading toward Reed's Crossing. They arrived at 11. Arthur Gaines was waiting at the hotel on the main street, sitting in the lobby, with a leather case on his knee and the patient, settled manner of a man who has made his decision and is not going to be talked out of it. He stood when Caleb came through the door and shook his hand without preamble. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "On her way," Caleb said. "She'll be here by noon." Gaines nodded. "Judge Briggs will see us at 2 o'clock. His clerk confirmed this morning." He paused. "I told the clerk we had evidence of fraud and land theft dating back 9 years. The clerk said the judge would want to see everything." He looked at Caleb steadily. "Bring everything." "It's in the wagon," Caleb said. At 10 minutes past noon, a wagon came down the main street of Reed's Crossing, and Margaret Holloway climbed down from it and helped her mother down after her, and Arthur Gaines walked out of the hotel and stopped on the front step and looked at Evelyn Holloway for the first time in 9 years. Evelyn saw him and went completely still. Then she said very quietly, "Arthur." Gaines came down the steps. He took both her hands gently, carefully, the way you hold something that has been damaged, and he said, "Evelyn, I'm sorry it took this long." "You're here now," she said. Her voice was steady. "That's what matters." Margaret stood a step back and watched her mother's face, and Caleb watched Margaret watch her mother, and he thought he had never in his life seen someone hold themselves together with such precise and deliberate effort. They went inside. They had 2 hours before Briggs. They used every minute of it. Caleb laid out the documents in order on the hotel room table, the ledger from the tin, Robert's notes from the satchel, the copied pages from his coat, and Gaines's affidavit, which Gaines produced from his leather case in its original form, folded and signed, and 9 years old and entirely intact. Evelyn added 3 things she had been carrying in a small cloth bag she'd brought from the ranch letters between Robert and Harold from the early days of their arrangement, written in Harold's own hand, that contradicted every claim Harold had made in the probate filing. Margaret sat at the table and went through everything with the focused, systematic attention of a woman who had spent 6 years reading Harold's accounts and knew exactly what she was looking at. "This column," she said, pointing to the ledger. "I've seen this accounting method before. Harold uses it to obscure payments that don't have legitimate business origins. The amounts here correspond to—" She stopped, traced a line across the page with her finger. "These correspond to dates. I need a moment." Nobody spoke. She worked for 10 minutes in silence, cross-referencing the ledger against Robert's notes, moving between pages, with the efficiency of someone who has had years of practice making sense of numbers that were deliberately designed not to make sense. Then she looked up. "He paid Morrison 4 times, she said. The first payment was 2 weeks before Papa died. The second was the week after the probate filing. The third was a year later, which was when Mama tried to access the county recorder's office herself and was told the relevant files were unavailable." She paused. "The fourth was 3 months ago." Caleb looked at her. 3 months ago is when he started accelerating the combined survey. "Yes." Her voice was very controlled. "He paid Morrison to bury the original filing so the combined parcel would have no record of dispute attached to it. Once that goes through, any claim we bring afterward looks like a late challenge to an established record." She set down the page. "He's been planning this specific move for at least 3 months, maybe longer." The room was quiet. "He always plans this far ahead," Evelyn said. Not with bitterness, with the flat, factual tone of a woman describing a natural phenomenon. Robert used to say Harold Vance was the most patient, dangerous man he'd ever met. "He was right," Gaines said. Margaret looked at Caleb. "Is it enough for Briggs?" "It's enough to open an injunction," Caleb said. "Stop the filing until the case can be properly heard." "That's all we need," Gaines said. "Stop the filing, and Harold loses his window. Once it's in front of a legitimate court with this evidence." He gestured at the table. "Harold's arrangement with Morrison becomes a criminal matter, and a man facing criminal charges has considerably less influence over county judges." "He'll know," Margaret said. "The moment that injunction is filed, Harold will know." "Yes," Caleb said. "He will." She met his eyes across the table. They both understood what that meant. The moment Harold knew, the careful equilibrium of the past 3 weeks would end. Whatever Harold did next, he would not do it quietly. "We need to be ready for that," she said. "I know," he said. "We will be." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the documents and straightened the pages with precise, deliberate hands. "All right," she said. "Let's go see a judge." Judge Harlan Briggs was 61 years old, small and dry and precise in the manner of a man who had spent 4 decades listening to people explain why the rules shouldn't apply to them, and had developed a thoroughgoing skepticism toward every possible variation of that argument. He received them in the courthouse meeting room at 2 o'clock. Exactly sat down without ceremony. Looked at the documents Caleb set before him and said, "Start at the beginning. Don't summarize. I'll tell you when to skip ahead." He didn't tell them to skip ahead once. He read everything himself. He asked Gaines 12 questions, methodical and precise, and wrote down each answer in a small notebook. He asked Evelyn 4 questions and listened to her answers with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who is genuinely trying to understand rather than simply confirm what he already thinks. He looked at Margaret last. "You've been the household accountant for this man," Briggs said, "for 6 years." "Yes, sir. And in that time, You observed financial irregularities that you believe correspond to these documented payments. Yes, sir. I can identify 4 specific instances in the household records that align with the ledger entries. I can also identify 3 contracts in the ranch accounts that appear legitimate, but are payments to entities. I could find no evidence actually exist. Fictional companies. $11,000 over 6 years by my accounting. Briggs looked at her over the top of his glasses. You committed those figures to memory. I have a good memory, she said, and I had reason to pay attention. Something shifted in Briggs's expression. Very small, very brief. Not quite respect. He was too careful a man to show respect prematurely, but something in that direction. Miss Holloway, he said, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Was there any point in the past 6 years when you had access to these records and could have removed them? She didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Why didn't you? She was quiet for exactly 1 second. Because removing them without the legal means to act on them would have accomplished nothing except alerting Harold that someone had looked. And alerting Harold without the means to stop him would have put my mother in danger. She paused. I waited until I had someone who could do something with what I knew. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. You're the someone, he said. Yes, sir, Caleb said. Briggs closed his notebook. I'm issuing the injunction today. It will be filed in Billings by tomorrow morning, which means Morrison will have it on his desk by noon. The combined survey filing will be blocked pending full evidentiary review. He looked at the documents on the table. I'll want originals in my possession, not copies. He looked at Caleb. How quickly can you get me the originals? Tomorrow morning, Caleb said. Briggs nodded. In the meantime, I'll send a telegram to the county sheriff in Caldwell. A man named Pierce, he's not Harold's in case you were wondering. Harold's tried and Pierce told him no, which is why Harold deals primarily with the deputy. He paused. Pierce will want to know what's coming. So will I, frankly. He looked at all of them. Harold Vance is going to be very unhappy about this. Yes, sir, Caleb said. He is. Is anyone in that house at risk? Briggs said it directly looking at Margaret. She didn't look away. My mother has been at risk for 9 years, she said. I don't expect that changes until Harold no longer has the power to act on it. Briggs wrote something in his notebook. I'll include a protective provision in the injunction language. It won't stop a determined man, but it creates a legal consequence for interference with witnesses. He closed the notebook. Go get me those originals, Mr. Whitmore. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon, and for a moment, none of them said anything. Evelyn stood beside the wagon with her hands folded and her eyes closed and her face tipped up slightly, and she stayed that way for a long moment while the cold air moved around her. Then she opened her eyes and said, Robert would have liked this day. Margaret put her arm around her mother's shoulders. Yes, she said quietly. He would have. They were back in Caldwell by early evening, and supper was on the table at 6 o'clock, and Harold Vance ate it without looking up from his newspaper. He didn't know yet. Caleb sat in the bunkhouse that night and thought about how short a window that was, hours, maybe before the injunction worked its way through the system, and someone who owed Harold a telephone call made it. He thought about Harold's face when he found out. He thought about the very quiet, very pleasant voice that said things like his arrangement will become considerably less comfortable. He fell asleep with his boots on. The telegram reached Harold Vance at 9:43 the following morning. Caleb knew the exact moment it arrived because he was working the fence line 50 yards from the main house, and he heard Harold's voice, and Harold's voice raised was something he had not heard before. Not the controlled quiet of the man who broke fingers and called it an accident. Something past that. Something that had reached the edge of the carefully managed surface and gone over it. He kept working. 5 minutes later, Danny appeared at his shoulder. Harold's on the telephone, Danny said quietly. He's been on it since the telegram came. I heard Morrison's name 3 times. Morrison can't help him now, Caleb said. The injunction is already filed. Harold doesn't know that yet, Danny said. He thinks he can still... He'll know by noon, Caleb said. When Morrison tells him the Billings office already has the block. Danny was quiet for a moment. What does he do then? He looks for someone to blame, Caleb said. And he looks for a way out. And if there isn't one? There isn't one, Caleb said. That's the point. Harold found out about the Billings filing at 11:30. Caleb heard the second round of it from the same fence line. Harold's voice harder this time, and then a silence that was somehow louder than the voice had been. Then footsteps fast across the yard. Harold moving with a purpose that was entirely unlike his usual deliberate proprietary ease. He went into the kitchen. Caleb dropped the fence tool and moved. He came through the back door without knocking and found Harold standing in the center of the kitchen with a piece of paper in his hand. The telegram crumpled at the edges where he'd been holding it, and Margaret standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand and her eyes steady and her spine straight and her chin level. Harold looked at her. Then he looked at Caleb in the doorway. Something moved across Harold's face in that moment, a rapid, ugly calculation. The look of a man assessing who knew what and how much and what could still be managed. "Get out of my kitchen, Whitmore," Harold said. "No, sir," Caleb said. Harold's eyes went very sharp. He wasn't accustomed to no. It had been a long time since anyone had said it to him with that particular quietness. "You're fired," Harold said. "That's all right," Caleb said. "I don't need the work." Harold turned back to Margaret. The calculation in his face had shifted, hardening into something that Caleb recognized and did not like at all. "You did this," Harold said. His voice was quiet again. The bad quiet. "You went through my accounts. You took papers that belonged to this ranch." "Those papers belong to my family," Margaret said. The words came out of her with a steadiness that Caleb thought must have cost her something, not because she was frightened, but because she had been holding them back for 9 years, and releasing them required a kind of controlled force that didn't look like effort from the outside, but absolutely was. Harold took a step toward her. Caleb moved from the doorway into the kitchen. One step, just one. But Harold stopped. He looked at Caleb, looked at the distance between them, made another calculation. "You have no idea what you've done," Harold said. "Either of you. The judge the injunction that means nothing. You have Morrison," Margaret said, "who is currently explaining to the county recorder's office in Billings why he altered the original Holloway land filing 9 years ago. Because they have the original affidavit now, signed, witnessed, dated 3 weeks before my father died." She paused. "You have a ledger full of payments to a public official that constitutes criminal bribery under Montana territorial law. And you have 11 years of tax fraud that the county assessor's office is going to find very interesting once Judge Briggs forwards his findings." Harold stared at her. She didn't look away. "You told this town I was lazy," she said. "You told them I was slow. You told them my mother and I were lucky to have your charity and that nobody else would want us. You told people who had never spoken to me what I was and what I was worth, and they believed you because you had money and standing and a pleasant voice, and they had no reason not to." Her voice was perfectly level. "And I let you do it. I let you do it for 9 years because it was the price of keeping my mother safe. I cooked your food, and I cleaned your house, and I never said a word about what you were doing, because every time I thought about speaking up, I looked at Mama's hand, and I remembered what the cost of speaking up was." She set the wooden spoon down on the counter very deliberately. "I'm not looking at her hand anymore. I'm looking at you." Harold's face had gone through several things while she was speaking. Contempt, initially. Then something sharper, more alert. And then, in the last few sentences, something Caleb had never expected to see on Harold Vance's face. He wasn't entirely certain, but it looked like fear. Not the managed, calculated version he probably wore sometimes when he was working through difficult situations. Something more fundamental than that. The fear of a man who has built his entire world on a particular story about himself and has just watched someone dismantle it with a wooden spoon still in her hand. "You can't prove," Harold started. "I have your own ledger," Margaret said. "In your own handwriting. Arthur Gaines's affidavit. My father's 37 pages of notes documenting every conversation, every transaction, and every lie you told him from the day you met. I have your letters, Harold, in your hand. saying things that contradict every claim you made in that probate court." She stopped. "What exactly is it that I can't prove?" The kitchen was very still. Harold looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then back at Margaret. The calculation in his face had gone. There was nothing left there now that looked like confidence. Just a man standing in a kitchen he thought he owned in a house he thought he controlled, staring at the person he'd spent 9 years reducing to furniture and understanding, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had been wrong. He walked out, not dramatically, not with a threat or a parting word. He simply walked out the kitchen door into the yard, and his footsteps crossed the hard ground toward the main house, and the door of his office closed behind him. Caleb looked at Margaret. She was standing at the counter with her hand resting on the wooden spoon and her eyes on the door. Harold had walked out of, and her shoulders were shaking. Not much. Not enough that anyone who didn't know how to look would notice, but they were shaking. "Margaret," he said. She turned. Her eyes were bright and dry, and there was something in her face that was not quite relief, and not quite triumph, and not quite grief. Something that contained all three, and was larger than any of them individually. "He was afraid of me," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "For the first time in 9 years, he was actually afraid of me." "Yes," Caleb said. "He was." She pressed her lips together. She breathed in slowly. She straightened her spine, that deliberate armored straightening, and then gradually, visibly, she let some of the armor come down. Not all of it, but enough that what was underneath could be seen. "I need to go tell Mama," she said. "I'll come with you," Caleb said. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. They found Evelyn in the sitting room in her chair, her hands in her lap, her eyes open. She had heard Harold's voice. She had heard the tone of it. She looked up when they came in, and she read their faces in the half-second, the way she read everything fast and completely. "It's done," she said. "It's started," Margaret said carefully, coming to kneel beside her mother's chair. "It'll go through the courts. There will be hearings. It won't be instant." "But he knows," Evelyn said. "He knows," Margaret confirmed. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out with her good hand, her right hand, the one Harold hadn't broken, and she put it against her daughter's face. Margaret covered it with her own hand and closed her eyes. "Your father would be so proud of you," Evelyn said. The sound Margaret made was small and brief, and it was the most unguarded thing Caleb had ever heard from her. He looked away at the window at the yard outside, where a cold wind was moving across the empty ground. When he looked back, Evelyn was looking at him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Ma'am." "Thank you." She said it simply, directly, without the weight of ceremony. Just the plain fact of it offered to a man who had earned it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He wasn't sure what else to say. The gratitude felt larger than any response he could make to it. Sheriff Pierce arrived at the Vance Ranch at 4 o'clock with 2 deputies and a document from Judge Briggs that outlined the charges, the evidence, and the legal steps that would follow. Harold Vance received him in the front parlor. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When Pierce came out, he found Caleb waiting in the yard. "He's cooperative," Pierce said with the neutral tone of a man who finds a thing surprising but won't say so out loud. "More than I expected. My read is, he's calculating, trying to figure out how much he can limit the damage." "He won't be able to limit much," Caleb said. "Morrison is already talking." Pierce raised an eyebrow. "Fast." "Scared men talk fast," Caleb said. Pierce nodded slowly. "The women, Mrs. Holloway and her daughter, they'll be all right here tonight, or do I need to make arrangements?" "They'll be all right," Caleb said. "I'll be here." Pierce looked at him with the assessing eyes of a man in his profession. "You're the hand that found the evidence." "Yes, sir." "Good man to have around, then." He picked up his reins. "Tell Miss Holloway the court date will be set inside 2 weeks. Judge Briggs moves fast when he's motivated, and I haven't seen him this motivated in a good while." He paused. "Tell her also that the land claim will be addressed as part of the criminal proceedings. She and her mother should start thinking about what they want to do with 400 acres. He wrote out, Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment. 400 acres. I went to find Margaret. She was back in the kitchen. Of course she was, because supper still had to happen, and the hands still had to eat, and the world still ran on its ordinary tracks, even when the extraordinary thing had just occurred. She was at the stove, moving through the familiar motions, and when Caleb came in, she glanced at him over her shoulder. "Pierce is gone," she said. "Yes, he says the court date will be set in 2 weeks. He paused. "He said to tell you to think about what you want to do with 400 acres. Her hand stopped moving on the stove. Then she turned, slowly, and she looked at him with an expression that was made of too many things to name the past. 9 years of it, the shape of everything she had carried, and was still carrying, and would carry for a while yet, and underneath all of it, something new and tentative and enormous. 400 acres, she said. "Yes, ma'am." She stood there in the middle of the kitchen that she had worked in for 9 years, without it ever being hers, and she looked at nothing in particular for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "Birch Creek runs through the eastern edge. Papa used to take me there when I was small. He said the soil along that creek would grow anything." "Good soil, then," Caleb said. "The best," she said. Her voice was soft. He always said it was the best land he'd ever owned. Caleb looked at her. At the set of her jaw, and the brightness in her eyes, and the hands that had cooked 10,000 meals, in a house that treated her like furniture, now resting at her sides, in a kitchen that was about to stop being Harold Vance's. "Miss Holloway," he said. She looked at him. "What do you want to do with it?" She was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the stove settled. Outside, the wind had picked up the kind that came before snow-dry and searching. "Something that matters," she said. "Something that would have made Papa smile." "Then that's what you'll do," he said. She looked at him for a moment, that long checking look she gave him, sometimes the one that went past the surface to see what was actually there. And whatever she found satisfied her, because she nodded once and turned back to the stove. "Supper in 20 minutes, she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He sat at the kitchen table. She cooked. The ordinary rhythm of it was entirely different now, the same motions in the same kitchen, but the air in the room had changed, like a window had been opened somewhere, like something that had been held too long under pressure had finally fully found a way to breathe. Evelyn Holloway came in from the sitting room and settled in her chair by the fire without being asked, and she looked at her daughter's back and then at Caleb, and she smiled a small, private, complete smile that held 9 years of patience and something that looked very much like vindication. Caleb picked up his coffee cup. In Harold Vance's office, the telephone was silent for the first time in weeks. The snow came that night, not the threatening building kind that announces itself for days, the sudden kind, the kind that arrives without ceremony and covers everything equally, the way truth sometimes does. Caleb lay in the bunkhouse and listened to it settle against the walls and thought about 400 acres along Birch Creek and a woman who had spent 9 years being told she was worth nothing by a man who had stolen everything from her. I was still thinking about it when morning came, gray and white and entirely new-looking. Harold Vance did not come to breakfast. The hands ate in a silence that was different from the usual silence, charged with something full of the particular discomfort of people who sense that the ground has shifted but aren't yet certain in which direction they'll need to move. Margaret served breakfast the same way she always served it. Coffee, eggs, biscuits. Her eyes were clear, and her movements were steady, and she did not look like a woman who had stood in front of the most powerful man in the county the previous afternoon and watched him flinch. But she was. And every man at that table could feel it, even if not one of them could have said exactly what had changed. It was the young hand, the sunburned one who'd laughed at her on Caleb's first night, who broke first. He came back into the kitchen after breakfast with his plate, which ranch hands did not do, and he set it near the basin and said without quite looking at her, "Much obliged for breakfast, Miss Holloway." Margaret looked at him for a moment. "You're welcome," she said, simply, without irony, without the weight of everything she could have said instead. He left quickly. Caleb, still at the table with his second cup of coffee, watched the whole thing and said nothing. "You could have made that harder for him," he said when the boy was gone. "I know," Margaret said. She was clearing the table. "But I'm not interested in hard. I'm interested in different. She set a stack of plates near the basin. He's 20 years old. He learned what he learned from men like Harold. That's not entirely his fault. Caleb looked at her. You're remarkably patient with people who weren't patient with you. I had 9 years to practice, she said. The corner of her mouth moved. Also, I'm not patient. I'm strategic. There's a difference. He laughed. It surprised both of them, the genuine, unguarded quality of it. He hadn't laughed like that in a while. It felt like something coming back to life. She looked at him with an expression he was getting better at reading, the one where something wanted to show on her face, and she was deciding whether to let it. She let it, just briefly, just enough. Then she went back to the dishes. The court proceedings began 11 days later in the county seat, in a courtroom that was smaller than its authority warranted and fuller than anyone had anticipated. Half of Caldwell showed up. That was the thing nobody had predicted. Not Caleb, not Margaret, not even Judge Briggs, who had been doing this long enough that he thought he'd stopped being surprised by what people chose to witness. But they came. Ranchers and merchants, and the minister and his wife, and the 2 men from the saloon who had laughed about Margaret on Caleb's first night in town. They filled the benches and stood along the walls and watched with the particular attentiveness of a community that has just discovered something about itself that it isn't certain it likes. Harold sat at the defendant's table with a lawyer from Billings who cost more per hour than most men in that room made in a week. He wore his good suit. His face was composed and careful and completely unreadable. Margaret sat in the gallery with her mother on one side and Caleb on the other. When the proceedings opened, Judge Briggs read the charges with the dry, precise efficiency that was apparently his only mode of operation. Fraud, bribery of a public official, falsification of legal documents, land theft through fraudulent probate proceedings. He read them the way a man reads a grocery list item by item without inflection, and the room got quieter with each one. Harold's lawyer objected to 3 items before Briggs had even finished reading. Briggs said, noted to each one without stopping. You'll have your opportunity, counselor. Morrison had already entered a plea agreement in Billings. That was the first piece of information that hit the courtroom like a stone into still water, the ripples going outward in every direction. Morrison had provided a full written account of his arrangement with Harold, including dates, amounts, and the specific alterations he had made to the Holloway land filing. He had done this, his own attorney had noted, with considerable speed and thoroughness, which was what frightened men did when they finally understood the size of what they were caught in. Harold's lawyer called it coerced testimony. Briggs asked him to define coercion in this context. The lawyer could not do so to the court's satisfaction. Then Arthur Gaines took the stand. He walked to the front of that courtroom with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something true, and he sat down and he told the court what he had seen and heard in the early days of the arrangement between Harold Vance and Robert Holloway. He produced his affidavit. He explained in precise and unambiguous terms that the land agreement Harold had presented in probate court was not the agreement he had witnessed. He said Robert Holloway had been a man of his word, who had been defrauded by a man who understood that the dead cannot defend themselves. Harold's lawyer cross-examined him for 40 minutes. Gaines did not change a single word. When Gaines stepped down, he walked back through the gallery and paused beside Evelyn Holloway's seat. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She put her hand over his. The whole exchange lasted 4 seconds. Caleb felt Margaret's hand tighten on the edge of the bench beside him. He put his own hand over hers. She didn't move it away. Evelyn was called next. She walked to the front of the courtroom with her bad hip and her careful dignity, and she settled into the witness chair like a woman taking her rightful seat at a table she'd been kept from for too long. She produced the letters, Harold's own letters, in his own handwriting, contradicting his own testimony. She read 2 of them aloud at Briggs's request in a clear and steady voice that did not waver once. When she was done, the room was very quiet. Harold's lawyer asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3 with the same direct precision, the same clarity, the same absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who has been living with the truth for 9 years and knows every corner of it. He stopped asking questions. Then Margaret was called. She stood up. Caleb felt the movement of it, the deliberateness of it, the way she took a breath before she rose, the way she carried herself down the aisle between the gallery benches toward the front of that courtroom. He watched people watch her, watched the room adjust to her, the men who had laughed, the women who had looked away, the minister who had believed Harold's story about Evelyn falling. She sat in the witness chair, and she looked at Judge Briggs, and she waited. What followed was 2 hours of testimony that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't particularly, at least not in the theatrical sense. It was precise. It was methodical. It was a woman with a very good memory and 6 years of enforced attention to financial records, laying out piece by piece and number by number exactly what Harold Vance had done and exactly how she knew it. She referenced the ledger. She referenced Robert's notes. She identified the fictional companies in the ranch accounts. By name, listed the dates of payments and cross-referenced them against corresponding entries in the ledger that showed where that money had actually gone. She did it without notes, from memory. In the same quiet, unhurried voice she used when she told you supper was in 20 minutes. Harold's lawyer objected 11 times. Briggs sustained 2 of them. Overruled 9. When the lawyer moved to cross-examination, he tried 3 different approaches in the first 20 minutes, challenging her memory, challenging her access to the records, suggesting she had personal motivation to misrepresent the figures. Margaret answered each challenge the same way. Directly. Specifically. With the particular calmness of someone who is not performing calmness, but actually has it because the truth requires no performance. On the third approach, the lawyer said, "Miss Holloway, isn't it possible that what you're describing is simply a misunderstanding of complex financial records? That you, without formal accounting training, have drawn incorrect conclusions from?" "I've been managing accounts for 6 years," Margaret said. "I taught myself to read a ledger the same way I taught myself everything else because nobody was going to teach me, and it needed doing. I can explain each figure I referenced and show you exactly where it appears in the original documents. Would you like me to do that?" The lawyer paused. "Would you?" Briggs said to the lawyer. His voice was entirely neutral. The lawyer said no. He had no further questions. Margaret walked back to her seat. She sat down beside Caleb and her mother, and she sat very straight and very still, and the only sign of anything she was feeling was the slight controlled exhale of breath when she settled. "You were remarkable," Caleb said very quietly. "I was honest," she said. "It's simpler than remarkable." Briggs took a 30-minute recess to review the full evidentiary record. When he came back, he took considerably less time than anyone had expected to issue his ruling. Harold Vance was found to have engaged in fraudulent land acquisition through the falsification of probate documents. The original Holloway land claim was validated as legitimate. The combined survey filing was permanently blocked. Criminal charges related to the bribery of a county official would be forwarded to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for separate proceedings, which Briggs noted with the dry understatement that was apparently his closest approach to emphasis, were expected to be substantial. Harold stood when the ruling was read. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. Harold shook it off. He stood straight, and he looked at the judge, and his face showed nothing, and Caleb thought that was perhaps the most telling thing of all, that a man who had just lost everything had nothing left to show on his face, because everything he'd been had been built on things that were never his to begin with. Then Harold looked at Margaret. She met his gaze without flinching, without triumph, without the performance of victory, just directly. The way she had been looking at him for weeks now, like a woman who no longer needed to measure the distance to the threat. Harold looked away first. He was escorted from the courtroom by his lawyer and 2 men who were not quite deputies, but were there in an official enough capacity that it amounted to the same thing. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled, and then something happened that Caleb had not anticipated. The minister stood up. He was a quiet man, Reverend Miles, the kind of clergyman who tended toward circumspection and took the long view on most things. He had believed Harold's story about Evelyn. He had not asked questions. He had been wrong and had lived with that without fully knowing he was living with it, which was perhaps the most comfortable kind of wrong to be in. He stood up, and he looked at Margaret, and he said in a voice that was not loud, but carried clearly in the silent room, "Miss Holloway, I owe you and your mother an apology. I failed you, and I'm sorry." The room was very still. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are," she said. "Not warm, not cold, honest. And I accept it, Reverend." He sat down. Then, one of the women from the far bench, a rancher's wife named Clara Hutchins, who had passed Margaret on the street 100 times without speaking, said, "I'm sorry too." She said it quietly and without drama. Just said it the way you say something when you've been holding it, and the holding has become more trouble than the saying. And then another voice, and another, and, not a flood, not the theatrical redemption of a crowd, suddenly transformed. Real people making real acknowledgments in real time. The halting, imperfect, genuinely costly kind. The kind that meant something precisely because it wasn't easy. Margaret received every one of them the same way. Without performance. Without the satisfaction of seeing people squirm. Without making it about herself in the way that would have been entirely forgivable and would have made it smaller. "I appreciate that," she said to each one. "Thank you." Evelyn sat beside her daughter and held her good hand tight and said nothing at all. Caleb sat on Margaret's other side and understood that he was watching something that didn't happen. Didn't happen often, a person receiving what they were owed with more dignity than most people brought to far easier moments. He thought he had never in his life admired anyone quite this much. Outside the courthouse in the cold white afternoon, Danny Pruitt was waiting. He handed Caleb a cup of coffee from the place down the street. Hot, real coffee, not bunkhouse, swill without explanation or ceremony, which was entirely Danny's style. "How'd it go?" Danny said. "She was extraordinary," Caleb said. Danny nodded once like that was the answer he'd expected. "What happens now?" "Harold faces the territorial prosecutor," Caleb said. "The land goes back to the Holloways. Morrison is already cooperating, so the Billings case should be straightforward." He drank the coffee. "It's not over. There'll be more legal proceedings. But Harold's finished. Whatever he manages to hold on to from here, it won't be power. Not in this county." "Good," Danny said simply. Margaret came out of the courthouse with her mother on her arm. She saw Danny and nodded. She saw the coffee in Caleb's hand, and something moved in her expression. "Is there more of that?" she said. "I'll find some," Danny said, and went. The three of them stood on the courthouse steps. Caleb, Margaret, Evelyn in the cold afternoon, with the snow still on the ground, and the sky going pale and pink at the edges toward the west. "What happens next?" Evelyn said. Not anxious, genuinely curious. The tone of a woman asking about a future she has, just for the first time in years, been permitted to consider. "We go home," Margaret said. "Which home?" Evelyn said. Margaret, it was quiet for a moment. Then, "Birch Creek. As soon as the legal transfer is complete. As soon as we can." She paused. "Papa always said the house on the East Ridge was the best vantage in the county. You could see all 400 acres from there." "How was right?" Evelyn said. "He was right about a great many things." Margaret smiled. A real one. The kind Caleb had not seen before. Not the almost smile from the kitchen. Not the dry curve of controlled expression, but an actual smile, the kind that comes from somewhere below the surface and can't be managed or modified once it starts. He thought it was the best thing he'd seen in a long time. The following months moved with the particular rhythm of things being built rather than endured. The legal transfer of the land was completed 6 weeks after the court ruling. Harold Vance, facing the territorial prosecutor's case, and the near-certain collapse of every financial arrangement he'd built over 2 decades, accepted a settlement that stripped him of the Vance Ranch holdings entirely. He left Caldwell on a Tuesday in January with 1 bag and no ceremony, and nobody watched him go because there was nothing left in him worth watching. Silas stayed. Margaret asked him to, and he accepted without making a production of it, which was very much in character. He had spent 9 years carrying guilt about Robert Holloway, and he spent the next several making himself useful in ways that were specific and practical, and never once referenced the guilt directly, which was also very much in character. Danny Pruitt turned out to be a surprisingly capable hand with a hammer, which became relevant sooner than anyone expected. The house on the east ridge of the Birch Creek property was not in good repair. Harold had used the land for grazing and hadn't maintained the structure. But it was solid underneath the way things built by Margaret Holloway tended to be. It needed work, and the work got done, and by spring it was a house again. Evelyn Holloway walked through the front door of that house on an April morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to leaf out, and she stood in the front room for a long moment without speaking. Then she went to the window that looked east over the property. All 400 acres of it, greening up with the season. Birch Creek catching the morning light in the distance, and she put her hand against the glass. "Robert," she said very quietly. Just his name, just that. Margaret stood behind her and did not say anything and did not need to. The kitchen on the Birch Creek property became the thing that Margaret made of it, which was exactly what she'd told Caleb. She wanted something that mattered, something that would have made her father smile. It started simply. A woman from the edge of town, married to a man who treated her the way Harold had treated the Holloways, came to Margaret because she'd heard that Margaret had stood up in a courtroom and she didn't know where else to go. Margaret fed her, talked to her, helped her think through what she needed and what she could do and what kind of life was actually available to her if she was willing to reach for it. Then another woman. Then two more. By summer, the kitchen at Birch Creek had become something that didn't have a name yet. Not a charity, not an institution, not anything official. Just a place where women who needed work could find it, where women who needed to think could do that too, and where Margaret Holloway cooked the kind of food that made people feel like someone had noticed them. Word traveled the way. Word traveled in small places, through the women who'd been helped, through the conversations those women had with others, through the particular grapevine of people who know which doors are safe to knock on when the official ones are closed. By September, Margaret had 6 women working alongside her. By the following spring, she had 12. The food became famous in the way that things become famous when they're genuinely good, slowly, without advertising, through the mouths of people who'd eaten it and couldn't stop thinking about it. She started selling to the hotel in Caldwell, then to the Mercantile, then to a restaurant in Reed's Crossing, whose owner had eaten at her table once and ridden 40 miles back to ask if she'd supply him. She said yes to all of it. She said yes because she had spent 9 years saying nothing, and because yes felt like a full breath after a very long time of shallow ones. Caleb stayed. I hadn't planned to, or rather he had told himself for about 3 weeks in December that he was going to move on in the spring, that his part in this was done, that Margaret had what she needed and didn't need a drifter occupying space in her new beginning. He had told himself this with considerable conviction and had been entirely wrong. He realized he was wrong on a Tuesday evening in February when he was helping repair the east fence on the Birch Creek property, and Margaret brought him coffee, real coffee from the kitchen in a proper cup, not the bunkhouse kind, and she sat on the fence rail beside him, and they talked about nothing in particular for an hour and a half, and he forgot entirely that he'd been planning to leave. He didn't make any formal announcement about it. He simply stopped planning to go. Margaret didn't say anything about it for a long time. She was, as she had noted herself, strategic rather than patient. She let him find his own way to the understanding that they had been building something, not just the fence or the house or the kitchen operation, but the thing between them that had started in a dark yard with a sound between a scream and a sob, and had grown steadily, and without either of them quite declaring it, into something with solid ground under it. She said something about it eventually, because she was Margaret Holloway, and she had spent 9 years not saying things she should have said, and she had no interest in continuing that practice. It was an evening in May. The creek was running high with snowmelt. They were on the east ridge after supper, where you could see the full 400 acres in the long evening light, and Evelyn was inside with her knitting and her piece, and the world was as quiet and large as it ever got. "You're still here," Margaret said. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "You were going to leave in the spring." "I changed my mind." "What changed it?" He thought about all the things he could say. The honest ones were numerous, and some of them were considerable. He settled on the most accurate one. "You," he said. Specifically the Tuesday you brought me coffee and sat on a fence rail and talked to me like I was someone worth talking to for no particular reason. That was the one. She was quiet for a moment. That was February, she said. Yes, ma'am. That was ordinary Tuesday behavior, she said. I talk to people. Not the way you talk to me, he said. And you know it. She looked at him. He looked back. The evening light did what it did out here, turned everything gold and honest, left no convenient shadows to hide in. I'm not an easy woman, she said. I have strong opinions, and I run things the way I decide to run them, and I have a mother who comes first and always will. I am not... She stopped. The familiar gesture almost imperceptible now, the one she made sometimes when she was about to reference herself. I am not what most men mean when they say they're looking for someone. I know that, Caleb said. I'm not most men, and I'm not looking anymore. I already found her. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said, You should know I haven't forgiven this county entirely. I probably won't for a while. That seems reasonable, he said. And I'm going to keep growing the kitchen operation. I have 4 more women coming in September. I'll fix the south wall before they get here, he said. It needs it. She looked at him. And then, not shyly, not with the performance of a feeling carefully managed, but directly the way she did everything, she reached out and took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers. They stood on the East Ridge in the long May evening, and looked out at 400 acres of land that had been stolen and recovered and was now growing something new, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed saying. The town of Caldwell changed the way towns change slowly, imperfectly, with backsliding and complication, and the occasional person who decided the new version of events was just as convenient to misremember as the old one. But it changed. Harold's departure had removed something from the air, a particular kind of atmospheric pressure that people had been breathing so long they'd stopped noticing it, and its absence made space for things that had been crowded out. Clara Hutchins started sending women to Margaret's kitchen. Then she started coming herself, not for help, but to help, which was a different thing, and cost her something, and Margaret accepted it with the same direct honesty she brought to everything. The minister delivered a sermon in October that the town talked about for a month, not because it was eloquent, which it wasn't particularly, but because it said plainly that the congregation had participated through their silence in the suffering of 2 women who had been in front of them for 9 years. He said the right thing done late was better than the right thing never done, and he said they should start doing it. People shifted in their pews and went home and thought about it, and some of them did something about it, and some of them didn't, and that was approximately what you could expect from human beings, which was enough. Arthur Gaines visited twice a year. He and Evelyn would sit in the kitchen at Birch Creek and drink coffee and talk about Robert, the way people talk about someone beloved. When enough time has passed that the grief has softened enough to let the love come through properly. Gaines had never married. He had apparently spent a considerable portion of the past decade regretting that he hadn't done more earlier, and the visits to Birch Creek were part of how he was spending the rest of his years more satisfactorily. Silas turned 68 in November and said he had no plans to stop working because what else would he do, and nobody argued with him. Danny Pruitt bought a small piece of land 2 miles south of Birch Creek and started running his own operation, and he still showed up when there was something that needed more than 2 pairs of hands, and Margaret still kept a coffee cup that was understood to be his. Evelyn Holloway's hand never fully healed. The fingers that Harold had broken had set wrong the way bones do when they're not properly treated, and the cold bothered them, and there were things she couldn't do that she used to be able to do. She never said this was anything other than the cost of a choice she'd made, which was the choice to survive in the only way available to her at the time. She said that without self-pity and without drama, the way she said most things. On a morning in the following October, a cold, clear morning, with the aspens gone golden along the creek and the sky, the deep particular blue of high Montana autumn. Evelyn sat in her chair by the kitchen window and watched Margaret and Caleb in the yard below. Margaret was directing 3 of the newer women in the proper management of the kitchen garden, talking with her hands emphatic, clearly disagreeing with someone's assessment of where the second planting row should go. Caleb was near the fence with Silas and Danny doing something with a post that apparently required all 3 of them, and a level of discussion disproportionate to the task. The sound of Margaret laughing carried through the glass. Evelyn put down her cup. She had waited 9 years for that sound. Not the almost laugh from the kitchen, not the brief dry brightness that showed up sometimes at the edges, the real one. The kind that comes from a person who has put down a weight they carried so long they forgot it was a weight. The kind that comes from the inside out when someone finally has enough room to let it. She listened to it for a moment. Then she picked her cup back up and looked out at the 400 acres and the creek catching the October light, and her daughter standing in the yard of her own land on her own terms, laughing. "I told you," she said very quietly to the morning, to Robert, to the 9 years, to whatever had been listening. "I told you she'd be all right." Outside, Margaret's laugh came again, full and unguarded and absolutely hers. And the woman they had called worthless stood on her own land, in her own name, with her own voice, and the world she had built from everything they had tried to take from her was wide open all the way to the horizon. She had not survived to prove them wrong. She had survived to prove herself right. And that singular, unbreakable truth was the most powerful thing anyone in that valley had ever witnessed.